Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to be here. Today, I'm actually not going to present a single paper, but I'm going to talk about this phenomenon from which I have been working for quite a few years now. And it's about the globalization of home production and skilled women's outcomes. So domestic workers, foreign domestic workers, there are about 12 million foreign domestic workers in the world. They represent about 20% of all domestic workers. That's compared to about 2 to 3% of population are international migrants. Among migrants, they represent about 8% of all migrants, and within female migrants, they represent almost 1 out of 5 female migrants are a foreign domestic worker. And of course, there's variation across countries into how many of them there are. And in some countries, in particular in East Asia, they're very, very common. And I'm going to talk a little bit about why they're so common. Here we have, for example, in Singapore, about 1 out of 5 households have a living foreign domestic worker. In Hong Kong, it's about 1 out of 7.5 households. And in Taiwan, which is less common, about 1 in 36.5. Why are they so common? In part because they have special programs, special visa programs in which they allow for the importation of living foreign domestic workers. Okay, now these are more structured ways in which domestic workers move to other countries, but of course there's like more organic ways, such as in the US, where they still represent a very, very high share of domestic workers in the US. So here I have the share of working in household occupations. When we look, for example, at native women, very few native women work in the domestic sector. And over time, it has been going down. So it's less than 4%, and it has been going down. Now, when we look at foreigners, the share of foreigners that work in the domestic sector, the foreign women, we have that it was decreasing over time. It has always been higher than for native workers, but it has been going down over time until, my guess is the change in the immigration law in the US, which allow for many more people from low-skilled countries to come, and then we see a big increase in the concentration in the occupation. This has allowed the share of the economy that is working in the household sector to actually catch up a little and increased over time. Yes, George.
If you go back to the previous slide.
Yes.
Is there similar data to that? No, the one that one. Is there similar data to that for like the U.S., like a particularly immigrant area like Los Angeles?
So I'm going to show you for across states. There's a little bit different, right? Because they're not usually living, which is going to be an extreme way of outsourcing household production, right? It's kind of, they do everything for you. Right. In the US, it's much less common to have living. I think it's very, very uncommon, but it's more common to hire the housekeeper that comes 1 or 2 a week, or the nanny that comes every day from, I don't know, 7 to 7, right? These are the most complete form of outsourcing household production.
Those ratios are in living?
All of them are living. These programs are living in part because they want to link the household to the worker, and the worker can only live in that house and work for that household. There's no mobility across occupations for them.
The reason I'm curious is because when I used to live in San Diego, you never see this in Boston. In San Diego, you actually saw families who had living Mexican.
It might be, yes. And they're going to be foreigners. If there's a living domestic worker, is for sure going to be immigrants. And I'm going to talk a little bit about it because I'm going to talk about it when I talk about prices, because I think not only they decrease prices, but they offer a different service that usually natives will, right? It's a much more flexible service when it comes from immigrants. Okay, so here, what we see is that on one hand, I think the inflow of low-skilled immigrants allow for the household sector to increase, right? And it has become like very intensive in immigrants. So today, for the whole US, and there's going to be huge variation across states, about 35% of household workers are foreign-born, right? Now, when we look at states, we see, of course, there's huge variation across states in immigration. There's huge variation across states in the share of workers, domestic workers that are foreign. And you see in places like Nevada and California, it's more than 60% of domestic workers are foreigners. And of course, in states where there are very few immigrants, they represent almost nothing. And there's going to be a positive correlation between the size of the domestic sector and immigration. Okay, so why do I think that this is a particularly interesting kind of immigration, right? They're workers like other immigrants. It's going to substitute mostly for female labor, right? Because still at this day and time, women are the ones who bear the big responsibility in the household, and if they're going to substitute for some labor, it's going to be female labor, and it's likely going to be high-skilled labor, right? Now, when high-skilled women were working in the household, they're not taxed, right? The work is not taxed. Now they're going to release high-skilled women that allow for better allocation of talent. It also possible taxed their income. Now, things that also are particular of this type of immigration in those countries in which they go to live in that I think are problematic, first, they cannot migrate with their families by design, right? So they have to leave the family behind, and because the workplace is the household, the home, right, they are definitely more vulnerable to abuse, right? And it's very difficult to enforce labor laws inside the household. And I think that's an important concern about this type of living domestic workers. And there's horror stories in some of these countries.
Sorry, but
yes?
is there evidence that these foreign domestic helpers crowded out native domestic helpers? I mean, at some point, I guess they existed, right?
So I think somehow, but with domestic work, at least what I know about Hong Kong, and I'm not an expert in US history, but domestic work has always been done by certain populations, right? So in Hong Kong, they used to be done before they opened the borders to domestic workers for a certain type of Chinese group that was kind of disappearing, right? And my guess is in the US, and you correct me, it used to be the case that it was mostly women of color, right? So I think in a sense, it's kind of somehow of stigmatized occupation. So I don't think there are that many. I mean, nannies is different, I think, but living household work, I think I think it would be disappearing if there were not immigrants. Yes?
I have a general question before you get
Yes.
started, and that is, so why is living domestic work so unusual in the U.S. when there's so many immigrant women? You can hire them.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I've thought about this.
Service to have if you could afford it, and most people could afford it.
I don't know. You know, I've thought about this too. I think there's something cultural about having somebody in your house living with you. You are definitely giving up some privacy. I think also there's this sense that this power relationship that some people don't like to have, that is very common. Like where I'm from, Colombia, it's very common to have live-in, and there's a huge class distinction and social that is not there in the U.S. I think this is more work for, I don't know, a sociologist, but I think it has to be a little bit, it has to be related to something about culture, right? Like in other work that we're doing, it seems like in certain countries, people really don't like to outsource, like their childcare, like Germany, they're unlikely for some reason they believe they should raise their own children. I think it's part of the cultural differences of, you know, what we believe is our household, what do we believe we should do, because it's not common. It's going to be common, though, I think, among like immigrants, right? So, for example, in the World Bank, when they bring people from outside, they have a visa for bringing a domestic worker who lives with them, right? And I think, yes, they sponsor it, right? And I think it's within that population is very common, but in the U.S. it's just not. Okay.
Sorry, but so about the tax system.
Yes.
So this is according to reality or the letter of the law? Like, for example, in Spain, it should living domestic workers or high.
No, they do. What I'm saying is that before they come, right? I'm a high-skilled woman. I'm producing labor, right? In my household, I'm not being taxed, right?
Okay.
When I go out and start working,
Okay.
right? There's some potentially some fiscal benefit, right?
Okay.
Because you're taxing my income if I'm now working outside. Okay, so what I'm going to do today is first I'm just going to give you a very simple theoretical background or on how the low-skilled immigration will actually affect female labor supply and think a little bit about what kind of women would be the most susceptible to be affected by the changing prices of household production. Then I'm going to talk about some combination of papers of mine, of other people, on some of these outcomes. First, I'm going to talk about evidence on the effect on prices. That was my job market paper years ago. Then I'm going to talk about labor supply, like a decade ago. And then I'm going to talk about a more recent paper that is on the gender pay gap. And then I'm going to talk about some other people have looked at other outcomes. I'm going to talk about that. I'm also going to talk, so this part is usually going to be mostly about the US evidence, but then I'll move to a paper I have on the Hong Kong program. Yeah, and then I'm going to end just thinking about what this migration means both from the sending and the receiving countries. Okay, so it's a very, very simple model, right? Basically, we should think as a woman, and I'm going to assume here the husband doesn't do anything. So there's a woman, right? And she has to allocate her time between leisure, household production, and market work. And she has an earned income M that you can think of as the husband's income, how rich the husband is, okay? Now, she's going to consume two goods. One is the market good, which she has to buy outside the market. And then there's going to be a household service or good. And I'm going to fix the amount of household work of household good that a household needs to run smoothly. And that's going to be R units of the household good. And this service can be produced at home with the woman's time, or each unit of this household good can be bought in the market at price B, okay? Now, the utility is separable in the market good and in leisure. And the household production function is going to have positive marginal but decreasing returns to household work. And what this is going to guarantee, which I think is true, is that nobody completely outsources the whole household production, right? So still, and there's work about it, women will devote some time, especially with their kids and educational activities with their kids. So those are the kind of things that you don't outsource, okay? So if you solve the model, there are going to be several cases, right? The first case is when the wage, so the woman earns wage W in the market. When her wage is very low, right? But also she doesn't have a husband, or her husband doesn't have a lot of money, then she has to work in the market because she has to consume the market good, right? So she's going to produce the whole R by herself, and then she's also going to work in the market. And she's not going to buy the household good, right? Because it's too expensive for her. Now, case two is in the case in which the women's wage outside of the market is relatively low, but the husband's income is high enough that she doesn't need to work in the market, right? Because she can buy the private good, the market good with her husband income, and she's a stay-home wife, basically, right? And this kind of household is not going to buy household services either, okay? She's going to produce everything. Now, there's a case in which her wage is very low, but her unearned income is very high, in which case she can buy, Hillel is sleeping, but okay, that's good. She can buy, he doesn't do any household production, I can tell her, she's not interested. Sorry, so there's a low wage, right? But her husband is rich, So, she can buy a lot of leisure and outsource household production, right? And I think when we think about domestic workers, I think one case of this is Saudi Arabia. So Saudi Arabia is going to be the countries in which the highest ratio of foreign domestic workers to households is going to be about 1 out of 8, right? It's very, very, very common, but still women's labor force participation is almost non-existent. So here is just consumption of leisure, what they're doing, right? This is not going to be the US.
But that's also the case because there are cultural restrictions on the employment of women. That
No, absolutely. I mean, this low wages mean captured that, it's just by consumption of their own leisure.
I've heard that Saudi Arabia now has one of the highest proportions of college-educated women.
Yes, and the unemployment rate is like 50% for them.
Exactly.
Yes, yes. But I mean, now is the case that some of them are working more than before,
Right.
but they have been hiring domestic workers from the Philippines for decades, right? So it's just consumption of leisure. That's what it is, right? Nothing to do with like allowing women to work. Okay. Now the final case is the case in which you have very high opportunity cost of household production, right? In which case you will choose to produce the household production until the marginal productivity in both is the same, and you will outsource some of your household production, right? You're not going to outsource everything because, as I said, their marginal productivity at home when you produce very little is very high, but you're going to outsource some of it, right? Okay. So what happens when immigrants come? So when immigrants come, what's going to happen is going to decrease the price of outsourcing household production, right? And what it's going to do is, depends on the type of families. If it's the family that they're not consuming the household production to begin with, and very far from the threshold in which it will make sense for the women to consume household production, then it's not going to affect them whatsoever, right? Because they're far from the threshold. Now, if she's already consuming some household production, some outsourcing some household production, and the price goes down, she's going to consume more of it, right? And there's going to be some people that the decreasing price will make them enter the market into outsourcing household production. Now, what's going to happen with household work? With household work, unambiguously, if you're buying more household production, outsourcing more household production, you're going to just put less work into the household, right? And what's going to happen to market work depends, right? Because it depends if leisure is a normal or an inferior good, if leisure is sensitive to income effects, right? If income is not very sensitive to income effects, it's going to increase the labor supply of women, basically. Okay, so that's basically the model is quite simple, and it's just basically saying women with very high opportunity cost of their time in household productions are the most likely to outsource household production. Now, the next set of papers in which I'm going to look at the outcomes, I'm just going to discuss the empirical strategy that actually is used across all of the papers. And it's a very standard one. We've seen a lot of it already in the conference. We're going to just use the initial historical distribution of immigrants to allocate future flows. And we know what the problems are. One problem is, of course, the endogenous location. The other one is people just move as a reaction. Okay? And I should have said the empirical strategy is just as exploiting the city or state variation in immigrant concentration in the US, which we know is pretty high. And the instrument is just, this is the initial allocation in city I of country C, and then we sum across countries, and then we multiply by the national flow of immigrants from a given country and allocate them based on the historical distribution, a standard one. Let me this is just what I need to assume about the identification assumption and also the exclusion restriction. Okay, Now, the first part of the puzzle is prices, right? How does low-skilled immigrant affect the prices of the services? So this is a paper of mine in 2008. I used data from the CPI, confidential data, in which I have index of these services at the city level, which is not usually public information. So it's basically a price index for the price of babysitting in Boston or of gardening in San Diego, okay? Now in the paper, that I'm not going to go through it, I have a very simple Hirsch-Gerlach framework in which it's a small open economy that you can think of the city. There are two goods, a traded good and non-traded good. The traded good is going to be produced just by high-skilled labor, and the non-traded good is going to be produced by high-skilled labor and low-skilled labor. And low-skilled labor, here I'm going to allow for low-skilled natives and low-skilled immigrants to have a CES production function. So they might be perfect substitutes, they might not be perfect substitutes, okay? When you solve the model, what you find is that the price of the non-traded good, right, is going to depend on how, this is the intensity of the non-traded good in the low-skilled labor, okay? And it's going to depend also on the ratio of low-skilled to high-skilled labor, okay? So when immigrants come, how does they affect the price of non-traded good? It will depend on, first, how intensive is the non-traded good in low-skilled labor, right? And then part of it is the displacement of native low-skilled labor by immigrant low-skilled labor, okay? And in the paper, the non-traded low-skilled labor intensive goods, for which I have the index data, is babysitting, housekeeping, gardening, and I think maybe laundry and shoe repair. Some of the very intensive low-skilled immigrant services, okay? So what I'm going to do is going to run very simple regressions on the price index for the good, right, or the non-traded service on the predicted low-skilled immigration based on the instrument. And I don't know if you can see this, but I'll tell you what it is. This is the coefficient of the low-skilled labor, right? And here I have divided into different types of goods. So this is non-traded, intensive with low-skilled foreign labor, right? And what you see is, as the instrumented number of low-skilled labor in the city increases, the prices of these non-traded goods intensive in low-skilled labor decreases, okay? Then I have non-traded moderate use of low-skilled labor, then you see some decrease in their prices, but it's not really statistically significant, and I don't see any effect on non-traded goods that are intensive in high-skilled labor, because it only should affect those that are intensive in low-skilled labor. And it shouldn't have any effect on traded goods, which it doesn't. Okay, so the price of traded goods, even those that are intensive in low-skilled foreign labor, which you might think is like manufacturing or agriculture, then I don't find any effect because they're traded goods, and I'm just using variation at the city level. Okay, so this is basically the first paper showing that this inflow of low-skilled immigrants has decreased the prices of these non-traded services that are intensive in low-skilled immigrants. How much is this effect? Sorry. I find that the 1980-2000 flow of low-skilled immigrants reduced prices of these immigrant-intensive services by about 10%. And at first, I was a little bit surprised, not surprised, but it was, these kind of services are very intensive of labor, right? And then there was this literature using the same strategy of using this cross-city variation in immigrants that find no effect on wages. But I did find effect on prices, but most of these prices come from wages, right, because of the nature of the service. So what I find actually in my regressions is that when these low-skilled immigrants come, they do decrease the prices of the wages of low-skilled natives, but all low-skilled natives that look a lot like immigrants. So those that are of Hispanic origin, and some that report not speaking very well in English, suggesting, at least from my data, that they're not perfect substitutes with the typical low-skilled native. And that's how I explain that I do find price effects when some of the literature don't find the wage effects. Okay, then the next paper is going to look at, okay, when you look at these non-traded services, which are these non-traded services? They're babysitting, gardening, household housekeeping, and all of this has the characteristic that they're substitutes for household production. So the next step was like, based on the model, what happens to female labor supply when immigrants come and drop the prices? So it's going to be a straightforward equation in which I'm going to have the labor and again, I'm going to exploit cross-city variation in immigrant flows, low-skilled immigrant flows. I'm going to have the labor supply outcome, and it's going to depend on the low-skilled immigration intensity, and then control for city fixed effect, and I'm also going to include region times decade fixed effects. So I'm comparing cities in the same region in the US. So what do I find? I'm going to look at different education levels, right? And we're going to find the largest effect in usual hours work, which include both the intensive and extensive margin, mostly for this type of women that are professional and PhD. So professional are going to be MBAs, lawyers, doctors, and PhDs. And for them is the one that we're going to find the most effect. We're not going to find effects at the intensive margin. This is not extensive margin. That's not going to make anybody join the labor force. It's already quite high for this group. But it's going to increase significantly the hours they work. And importantly, because of the next paper, it's going to increase the probability that they work very long hours. Okay? Yes?
Professional PhDs are disproportionately foreign-born in the U.S.
Are what? Yeah, this is just natives.
Have you tried those regressions on native professionals and immigrant professionals?
I haven't tried on immigrant. These are natives.
These are just natives?
These are just natives. Yes, these are just natives. So we find an increase in the hours work, and we find an increase in the share who work very long hours. And this is going to be important for the next paper that looks at the gender gap, actually, right? And then for the others, we don't find much. At first, I was a little bit surprised, honestly, because you think that the marginal one that's going to be affected by these small changes in prices is not necessarily going to be like the most educated or the richest, right? Because they could already afford it, right? And that's where I think that low-skilled immigrants do provide another type of service. That is, if you have an immigrant, she's willing potentially to live in, she's willing to come to your house at 6 a.m., and she's willing to leave early, much later, right? Are much more flexible. And this is not a standard childcare. This is not 9 to 5 childcare. This is having somebody that will stay 2 hours more if you have to stay at work. Okay?
So beyond the price change, what do you think about the fact that before, like maybe they were just not available, like that high one?
Yes, there's not.
Pay, but there's not.
There's not. Actually, there's a site that we put there, and I think there was this woman who's coming for, what was it? It was during Clinton time, and she was a candidate. I think it was Attorney General. I don't remember.
Yeah. Kimball?
Yes, and she was close to being elected, and she would put down because they had demonstrated that she had hired an illegal immigrant. And what she's
reported on the taxes.
Yes, illegally, undocumented migrant.
Yeah.
And what she said is that I put an ad in the news saying I needed, given the nature of my work, I need somebody to live in my house who has papers, who is documented. And in when she said that, she said, I got 0 replies. There was 0 people that applied for the job. And it was not well paid. Nobody was willing to do it. So I think in that sense is where these immigrants, and that's going to be important for the next paper, are going to provide these services in which you can work very long hours. And that's going to matter for the gender gap. Okay. Now, this is showing something similar. Here I divide, right, this group into if women that work in occupations where there are very high wages, are they more responsive, right, measured by the male median wage hour. And we don't see that particularly. Women that work in very high wage occupations per se are the ones who are reacting the most. The ones that are reacting the most are the ones who work in occupations where men work a lot of hours. So it's not necessarily the doctors, right? Because somebody like a doctor, right, she can control her hours pretty well, right? But it's going to be more, we will see like MBAs or lawyers, which they really need to work these very long hours. Okay. So what are the magnitudes? So we find the lowest skill immigration flow of the, sorry, it should be 1980, not 1908, increased between about 46 and 48 hours a week, the time devoted market work by working with men with a professional degree or PhD, right? Of course, not every woman hire them, right? So it's on average, the effect was like 50 minutes, and they significantly increase the probability that you work very long hours, okay? And in the paper, we also show consistently that low skill immigration reduce the time that women work in the household using time use data, and using consumer expenditure survey, we find that they increase their expenditures in this kind of services. Okay. Yes?
Is it driven by specific cities in the U.S.? I would expect this effect to be in a city like New York, or like where men actually work longer hours. So is it, have you tried any geographical?
No, I haven't. I mean, it's going to be cities which there are lots of immigrants coming. But we will look at the occupations in 1 second. So let me just stop here 1 second and talk about evidence in other countries. So there's evidence in Spain on similar papers that look at how does this low skill immigration has changes, well, women labor supply, because although I just talked about the US, low skill immigrants working in the household sector are in across the globe, not just the US. There's also a paper in Italy that finds something similar. They find something interesting that I want to come back. It says that immigration substitute for welfare services. So impact is stronger where social and family policies are less developed. So I think that's something that we have to consider at the end. That is like, how much is this substituting for government provided services? Okay, and how much do we want that to happen, right? And then there's a more recent paper on cross-country that finds similar results, and also find that the effects are larger in countries with less support for family policies. Okay? Okay. So now let me move to the effect of the gender gap. And this is a paper in which, I mean, it has immigration on it, but the motivation of it came more from the gender gap part than from the low skill immigrant part. And the motivation came from Claudia Golden's presidential address in 2014, in which she argues that the reason why there is still have very persistent gender gap at the very top of the skill distribution in the US is because some of these occupations that guarantee very high wages also have the characteristics that you need to work very, very long hours and are very inflexible jobs, right? So we're thinking here something like lawyers, right? When you're a lawyer and you want to make it in a law firm, you have to work 80 hours a week, right? And it's very high returns to working long hours, because if you're not willing to work the 80 hours, right, and work 40 hours, you're dropping your wages very high because you're just in a different career path. Or professors and tenure, right? Or a career in a corporation. Unless you're willing to work these very long hours, right, your compensation is not proportional to the hours. You get these very huge returns to working long hours. If you decide to cut back hours, you have a big hit. Okay? Now, women have a much higher cost of providing this flexibility, right? Because they're the ones who are in charge in the household. And let me show you Claudia's figure, because I want to talk a little bit about the occupations here. So this is from Claudia's work. And on the x-axis, you have something like the elasticity of annual earnings with weekly hours, right? So this is basically, if it's greater than 1, means that you increase hours worked per week by 1%, and your annual earnings increase by more than 1%. Okay, so that's why I'll call very high returns to working long hours. What you see here is the residual gender gap, and you see this strong correlation that those occupations that have the highest return to working long hours are the occupations in when the gender gaps are the widest. And if you want to know what these occupations are, these occupations here is law, for example. Okay, law is one in which there's a very high return to working long hours, basically to make it to partner in a law firm, and that's where the gender gap is the highest, because probably women just drop out and work as family lawyers, right? Then you have all of these red dots are going to be business, where you also have very high returns to working long hours, and then you have some occupations like STEM or maybe medicine, right, in which there are no so very big returns to working long hours. Of course, you work more, you earn more, but it's not proportionally much more, okay? So she finds this a striking thing, and what she says is that we have these persistent gender gaps because for women it's very difficult to get this return to working long hours because of the constraints in their labor supply. So what we're going to do, sorry, where am I? No, sorry. So our idea was, look, if this is the case, that a major constraint for women to make it, right, in the labor market is because of this constraint in their time and their higher demand for flexibility, then if there's an exogenous shock to their ability to prioritize long hours, right, then we should see the gender gap in those occupations go down when the lowest skilled immigrants come, because we allow these women to work more, gain the returns, and the gender gap goes down. And this is particularly what we're going to do. And the idea of the paper was also to show if this is really the constraint that are preventing women from earning as much as males at the top of the distribution. So what we're going to do is we're going to run a regression. This is a regression at the occupation, city, year level, okay? This is the gender pay gap in the occupation at the city year level, occupation, city year level. And we're going to concentrate on this interaction. And this interaction is going to be the returns to working long hours for that occupation, right? That is an occupation level measure, right? So it's going to be high for lawyers, it's going to be not so high for doctors, right? And we're going to interact it with the immigration flows at the city level. And the idea is, in cities where there are lots of low-skilled immigrants come and allow women to work very long hours, those in occupations that have very high returns will see the gender gap shrink, compared to occupations in which, even though low-skilled immigrants come, because they're not returned to working long hours, the gender gap is not going to change that much. Okay?
Why do you take this measure in the 80s and not
Just to have more of a...
more of
Yeah, exogenous. Yeah, it's not going to matter much what we use. So what we find is that it's positive, right? So in places where lots of immigrants come and women work in occupations that have very high returns to working on hours, we see a decrease in the gender gap in that occupation in that city, okay? And we do it continuously, and then we do it we divide occupation in terciles depending on the returns to working long hours. Now, the other thing that we do is we're also going to look at how this inflow of low-skilled immigrants change women in the distribution of male earnings within that occupation, okay? So here, the Y is going to be the share of females in cities E and occupation I whose hourly wage belongs to the percentiles of males, right? So for example, this is the lowest 10th percentile, this is the highest 10th percentile, this is the mean of the dependent variable. You know, women tend to be at the lowest of the distribution of males' earnings. Well, 10% of men end in the bottom 10% of their wages. 17% of women are there, whereas at the top 10%, only 3.5% of women are the top 10% of males' earnings, right? And this is the occupation level at the city. And what we find is that in those cities where many immigrants come, and in those occupations that have very long returns to working on hours, we see fewer women in the bottom percentiles of the distribution for that occupation in that city, moving to higher percentiles in the distribution of the earnings of males. What we see that I think is interesting is that we don't see anything at the very, very top. Okay, so we see these immigrants coming and they're allowed to move into higher percentiles, but they don't get them quite at the very, very top of the occupation. Our conclusion there is there are potentially other barriers that are not just this ability to work longer hours that are preventing women to reach the very top. Something of a glass ceiling. Yes?
Do you know how much of this is intensive and extensive margin?
I don't think this that they're working, they're not joining, right? When we do back of the envelope calculations about how much per women is low skill immigrant allowing them to work more, given how many women do we think are the compliers, it's something like 19 hours per week. So my guess is what it's doing, it's allowing them to switch jobs. Within the same occupation, but switch jobs, right? So as I said before, it was not just maybe staying in the path for partnership in a law firm, right? Instead of dropping and becoming a family lawyer. So it's probably, these big changes you don't find unless it's a change in jobs. Yes?
Do you have a number for the aggregate effect of immigration on the gender gap?
It's a triple def, so I'll give you some magnitudes. Okay.
Sorry, Patricia. No, the wage, when you look at the effect on the wage gap, is the female wage going up or the male wage going down because of maybe substitution. So this is showing us that it's actually the female wage that is going up.
Yes, because it's increasing within the male distribution. Although the male distribution might be shifting, probably, so I don't know.
Have you looked at the effects?
No, I haven't. We just look at the gender gap. Okay. Yes?
When you calculate the gender gap, do you also do it conditional on age?
Yes, we have all of the controls here. Yes.
Because before that you said it's at the city occupation level, so you aggregate.
Yeah, the gender gap is the residual gender gap in an occupation, in a city, in a year, residual of age and flexible age function and stuff like that.
But you're not controlling for hours. The percentage for hours of work. Because that's right. I guess that's historical.
Yes.
Part of the gender gap is reduced.
No, but it's wage per hour. It's a gender gap in wage per hour, right? No, it's not a story of just working more. It's precisely the wage per hour when you work long hours is very high, right? So I'm controlling for work because I'm using wage per hour. That's the thing here. Okay.
Sorry. I didn't understand the answer that you gave. Extensive margin. So what I mean by extensive margin is people who didn't work and now work.
No, we don't see that. I show you a table with we don't find effects at the extensive margin. Most of these women work. Many of these women work. We don't find effects in the extensive margin.
And here
Okay.
you have everyone, married women with kids.
Yes, everyone.
Everyone.
Everyone. This is everyone. Okay. Now, the other thing that we do is, okay, does this change women's occupation choices, right? Because if I see that now I'm 25 to 30 and I'm choosing an occupation, and I would have loved to be a lawyer back in the day when I knew I couldn't get the returns to being a lawyer, right? Does this change women's decisions of occupations? Does the fact that they can now outsource and provide the long hours to be successful in a particular occupation make them change their decisions? And that's basically what we find here, right? So this is the share of college-educated women living in CTC working on occupation J, and we find that in those cities and occupations where lots of immigrants come and there are high returns to working long hours, there's more women choosing those occupations in which there are high returns to working long hours. So there's effect on occupation choice too. Okay, so the result from this paper, we find that the low-skill immigration lead to a small share of women to increase their hours by a large amount by offering a flexible service. Reduced form suggests that an increase, so this is the numbers. that an increase in the predicted labor for immigration flow from 1980 to 2010 led to a decline in the gender pay gap in occupations at the top themselves, a return to working long hours between 2 and 3 percentage points. So it's not a small effect. It also led young women to be more likely to choose these kind of occupations, but this low skill immigration didn't allow women to get to the very top of the occupation, suggesting that there are other constraints for breaking the glass ceiling that is just not flexibility. Yes?
I've read, I don't know if this is true or not, but I've read that in recent years there's been either a flattening or even a slight decline in the participation rate of very highly educated women in the U.S., right? And how would one explain that, given the very large increase in low-skill immigration? How would one explain the fact that women are beginning to withdraw from the labor market?
I think that's a myth. That's what they called, there was an article in the New York Times, right? That was like opting out. Now women are opting out. Like this Yale graduate after spending, and
that's the thing I read, yeah.
Yeah. People looking after that find no evidence that that is the case. Yeah, I mean, you find this, you know, the neighborhood for which this happened, and you're like, wow, she's dropping out after being, you know, Yale and in a law firm. But I don't think there's a strong evidence of that. Yeah, I mean, people have written papers afterwards showing that that is not the case. Yes, Hilal. Showing that you're awake.
What's in it for men?
What do you mean, what's in it for men? Do we care about that?
Is it substitution? Is it complementarity? You can think that both are increasing also.
I mean, when is it for men? I mean, I think to a certain point, if we believe, I mean, I think part of this is, look.
But you could look at results for men as well.
I mean, we do, in the labor supply paper, we do look at men kind of, I mean, it's not really a placebo because they can also be affected, right? But the effect for males are smaller, right? Which would suggest that it's not just through production, function, or complementarities between low skill and high skill labor.
Something on the marriage market.
Yeah, no, we haven't looked at that. I mean, what I have to say is that, you know, there's allowing women to reach their full potential has been demonstrated to increase GDP by some, right? It allows the allocation of talent to be much better if you have this. Yeah, I haven't thought much about men in this paper.
This table of the glass ceiling, you don't have it for men. The one on the probability of being at the top of the distribution.
But it's based on the male distribution. So there's always going to be the same share of males at the top by construction. Yes, Kevin?
Do you have any sense of how much of a story this is dependent on undocumented immigration driving a lot of low-skill immigration? So I'm thinking in my head, imagine the U.S. adopts a policy where we admit, like we just open the borders to low-skill immigration and allow them to come legally. Do we expect the same type of effects of them being able to go into this type of work, or is this mostly driven by the...
I think most of them are undocumented. That said, I mean, in the other countries I'm going to show you the evidence, they're documented, so it still works. Okay, let me just move a little bit because I want to go. Okay, so I'm going to skip this, but there's interesting work by other people looking at the effect on fertility, and she finds some effect on fertility. You might think that leads people, I mean, it's not clear because they also allow them to work more. So the effect on fertility is not clear, but she finds some effects on fertility. This is Delia Furtado. And then there's this other paper that looks in time investment of children, and what they see is that when low-skill immigrants come, they tend to take over, at least with respect to kids, what were called basic childcare activities such as bathing and feeding and stuff, but they displace it to basically more educational activities, right? So it increased the time high-skilled women spend with their kids doing more educational activities. Okay. Now let me move, with the last 10 minutes, 5 minutes I'm going to spend talking a little bit about the other option that is this very structured programs. Case here is going to be Hong Kong. So in Hong Kong, if you ever arrive to Hong Kong on a Sunday and you go to a square, it would be full of domestic workers because it's their free day, thousands of them, okay? So they all come from Indonesia, mostly Indonesia and the Philippines. It's a program, right? There's no quota. As many households as that fulfill the requirements can bring a foreign domestic worker. My guess is similar in Singapore, for example. The condition is an income condition. The household has to be above the median in terms of household income. They have to live with their employers and cannot work with any other family and job. The contract is for 2 years with possibility of renewal, and they are allowed a minimum wage. There's no minimum wage in Hong Kong for the population. This is the minimum wage for the domestic workers, and it's about today it's about $600 a month. And of course, they're provided food and where to stay because they live with the families.
On top of that, what is the rationale for opening this to Indonesia, Philippines, and not from mainland China?
I think the reason was that they look the same. So when the family goes out and there's a Filipino, it's very clear who the maid is. When it's Chinese, it's not. That was years ago when.
It's not a very economic rationale.
No, but they're not allowed. The mainline are not. It might be cultural, but it's not. I mean, that's the explanation I read years ago, that they're just ethnically different.
So that was introduced during the British mandate, but that it is continuing right now?
What?
This quota of workers.
Yes, this program?
And there was no change since Hong Kong became.
Yeah. This is recent data. They still, you go there. Every household has a live-in. I'm going to show you the numbers. Let me show you the numbers. So let me skip this. I'm just going to show you how relatively inexpensive it is to have a foreign domestic worker in the Philippines. Just to think about the U.S. versus Hong Kong. So this is the native average wage by education over the minimum wage for a domestic worker. Okay? So for these that are college-educated women, the relative price of domestic workers have gone down over time. And today, a high-skilled woman, native women, earn about 8 times the minimum wage that she pays for the foreign domestic worker. I did the similar calculation for the US, the average wage of college-educated women and the average wage of household workers, foreign, and it's about 3 times or 4 times. So this is quite relatively inexpensive. Now, how big is this? This is the share of women by education level. This is just for the higher education and age of the youngest child. I don't have here what it is, but this blue line is actually the share of households that have a high-skilled women and have a kid between the ages of 0 and 5 years old. And more than 60% of households in Hong Kong, where the woman has a college degree and a small kid, have a living foreign domestic worker. So it's a very, very, very prevalent. And you're going to find something similar in Singapore, for example. Okay? My co-author, who's Jessica, who's from Singapore, grew up with Filipino workers in her house. So I don't have time to go through what we do to estimate the effect. We have two empirical exercises. One is micro, the other one is just comparing Taiwan and Hong Kong, which had different programs. Yes?
Is there any research on the living conditions of these domestic workers in Hong Kong?
There are plenty of articles, not by economists, and they can be really bad. I mean, depends. I mean, it's you're lucky or not, right? It's like when you send your kid into exchange, right, for a year with a family, and he can earn in a horrible family, or he can have the best time of his life. I mean, I don't think they ever have the best time of their life, leaving their kids behind and being a household domestic worker. But that's why these programs are very controversial, right? Because I mean that's okay. So just let me say that when we do this work with a with Hong Kong, we find very, very large effects of this program on the labor force participation of high-skilled women. We find that for women that have kids between 0 and 5, it actually increased the labor force participation by 15 to 20 percentage points. And you can imagine, I mean, you're bringing somebody who basically does everything in the house, right? She cleans, she cooks, she picks the kids, she's the perfect, you know? So it does have big effects. Okay. So let me just spend the last 3 minutes, maybe, thinking about what are the implications of this type of migration, both for the sending countries and for the receiving countries. So on receiving countries, so one can think about fiscal implication or the better allocation of talent, right? These are freeing very high-skilled, talented women into getting their full potential. You can tax the full potential, get some fiscal benefits from that. There was a paper, old working paper on Kramer and Watts, and they argued that this can actually reduce inequality because there's a big inflow of high-skilled women to the market that reduces the wages of high-skilled workers, and that reduces inequality. At least on how it's the US, it's maybe actually not the case because it's actually allowing women to earn much more, right? It's not depressing their wages in these occupations, it's increasing their wages. And actually might exacerbate it, and I don't have time to show the table. We show that the biggest effect is going to be on household where the husband already works more than 50 hours. So this seems more like the power couples, right? That, you know, the man is already the law firm, and this allowed the women to have as good as a career as the male. Now, this is what worries me a little bit, but I mean, I have my strong feelings about this thing, especially in a place like Hong Kong, right? So now it's not the woman who does it, it's another woman who comes and lives with you, right, and does everything. And the gender norms of the allocation of the household are never going to change. Right? It's not in other places where when women's opportunities have been increasing and she's been going out of the labor force, gender norms have been changing a little bit in terms of the allocation of household work. So, and the other one is there's some evidence that, you know, this might crowd out or substitute for other type of government intervention to allow for more flexibility for women. Don't we want that? I don't know. Now, there's going to be even higher push for these programs because of the aging of the population. Some of the other papers, like yours, I think, that look at, you know, they also are disproportionately into occupations like house aides, right, or work in taking care of the elderly. Now, on immigrants of sending countries, if living, right, they're very vulnerable because their workplace is inside the household, which it's difficult to enforce labor laws to prevent abuse, sexual abuse, physical abuse, and there are plenty of evidence that this happens. Some countries, in response to this, have imposed age requirements. Right, so only women that are 25 or older can leave and become domestic workers somewhere else. And then on the other hand, given that usually these programs do not allow women to migrate with their families and they have to leave their kids behind, right? There's the concern of how good is this for the kids. And also, I mean, from the other side also, right, for the receiving countries, and I don't think there's work on that. Like now the kids are being raised by Filipina domestic workers, which by the way they speak English and they're usually college educated, but still they're being raised by the maid instead of the mother. How does that affect the kids? But more problematic, I think, is for these domestic workers that leave their family behind. And, you know, of course they do it because they send back remittances, and this allows for monetary investments in their human capital, but there's some evidence that it might be difficult for kids to grow up without their parents. Yes, George?
Yeah, I've seen research, not like student papers here or there, where they look at towns in Mexico. So in Mexico, it's sort of the opposite of what you're talking about. A lot of men leave.
Yes.
And there
Yes.
are towns in Mexico that basically have no men or very
Yes.
few men, right? And people have looked at the impact of no men in the town on the culture of the kids and all that stuff, right? What you're saying is that maybe towns in the Philippines, for example, where, because I suspect a lot of these women come from the same places and they leave from the same places, but there may be no women in the town. And it's just, is there any kind of comparable kind of research about that?
No, but men are living as seafarers. I mean, in the Philippines, there are these two big occupations in which migrants live and very regulated by the government. Women migrate as domestic workers or nurses, but more domestic workers. Men are seafarers. So there are a lot of men. I mean, it could be that different towns, that's different where they send, but it's not just, I think in Mexico it's only men. Here it's both genders and they go to different occupations. Okay, so with this I end. Thank you.